All right, well, I have 2 o'clock as the official time right now, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name's Emily Bell, and I'm the Communications Coordinator of the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Getting Familiar with Plant Families. We'd love for you to pop in the chat and say hi and let us know what area you're joining us from. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitats through education, research, planting, and conservation programs. Our work is made possible primarily through sales and renewals of the Florida State Wildflower License Plate. These funds, along with donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native wildflowers and plants throughout Florida. We'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the State Wildflower License Plate. And if you purchase or have the plate, you're eligible for a membership. So just let us know you have the tag and we can get you set up in our database. Be sure to check out our website for resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where to see wildflowers in bloom, for upcoming events, and more. We're also on social media, and you can find us on most platforms at FLA Wildflowers. Our next webinar on May 21st continues our Botany in Context series with Botanical Jargon, a concise and precise language for plants. And that'll set us up nicely to close out this series on June 18th with using keys to Florida plants. Also, stay tuned for many great field trips coming up. Our next field trip is this Saturday, April 19th, to River Oaks Preserve in Lee County in partnership with the Cocoloba chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society. There's still time to sign up before registration closes at the end of the day tomorrow. And if you're interested in visiting a fantastic field full of wildflowers in bloom, our annual favorite, the Wildflower Farm Field Days in Alachua County, are coming up at the beginning of May. Because this is always such a popular trip, we offer it on 2 days. This year, it will be Saturday, May 3rd and Sunday, May 4th. Be sure to follow us on social media or subscribe to our newsletter and check out flawildflowers.org/events to stay abreast of all of our webinar, field trip, and outreach opportunities. Really quickly, just a few housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are muted with cameras off. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature to submit them. The chat is active, but we don't monitor it for questions. You've got to use that Q&A feature. We'll address questions at the end of the talk as time permits. And if your question isn't answered, you can email it to us at info@flawildflowers.org. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website and on YouTube in about 24 to 48 hours. When it's available, you'll receive an email from us with a link to the recording, as well as a resource page with links from the webinar. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jim Folsom, who's been with us now for, I think this is number 4 in the series, and we're so excited to be continuing it. Dr. Folsom's lifelong love of plants is reflected in a BS in botany from Auburn University, an MA in biology from Vanderbilt University, and a PhD in research botany from the University of Texas at Austin. Though his research has centered largely on the orchid family, with much of that time spent in tropical America, including a year in Colombia on a Fulbright predoctoral fellowship, Jim's botanical interests are wide-ranging. For 35 years before his retirement in 2021, as curator and director of the Botanical Gardens at the Huntington in San Marino, California, he dedicated much of his effort to educational programs that increase public interest and understanding of science, culture, and history of plants and gardens. Topics reflected in his website, botanyincontext.com, as well as his TikTok channel, Botany in Context. He lives on St. George Island with his wife, Deborah, who's also a botanist, and they have 2 adult children, Molly and James. Jim currently serves as an incoming member of the board of the American Horticultural Society. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Jim and just give us a moment as we switch.
Figure this out. Okay. Let's see. Share and play. There we are. I hope everyone sees that. That's the tree of life in New Orleans. And I just learned there's one as beautiful there in Tallahassee. Tallahassee, by the way, is full of gorgeous trees. What an incredible street scene to just drive through the town or walk through. So the topic today is all in the family, plant families. And I'm going to go through some listings because I have been worrying about this for like the last 2, 3 months, trying to decide how best to present this and what kind of information would be useful for people. And I decided to just assault you with a lot of data and information. So I'm sorry about that. But if you can kind of sleep through it and just let it pass by. If you want to find out more about it, we are posting the notes to this lecture and all of the slides are there, so you can go back and check on things. So just let it blur by you if it's too much. Now, when we talk about plant families, you got to get your terminology straight. We're not talking about the Hatfields and McCoys. You got to retool your definition of family. The concept of plant families is like human family, the hominidae, which includes 4 genera, right? Today we recognize, I'm going to try to close that down. I got a thing there. Okay. Today we recognize over 415 flowers of plant families of flowering plants. And even the meaning of a plant family has changed in the last 200-300 years. Now we just think of a plant family as being a related group of plants that are separated from other groups nearby by some significant feature or historic or evolutionary character. And the trouble is there's no standard. Some plant families are huge and others are just one species. And the last thing to mention is that family names, like all plant names, have a type concept. So they're based on a type genus. But you'll find that historically, we use different names for families. And so almost every family name has been conserved so that the rules don't quite apply to it. Now let's look at a presentation of this. If you visited the website for Botanical Garden, the Washington, the DC Botanical Garden, the National Botanical Garden on the web, you would see they've put up in the last a couple of years a really nice sort of sweet presentation of plant families in a tree of life. And so here we have the base, and you can see the liverworts and the algae and the mosses, and then the ferns and the pines, and all of this whole lopsided part of this family tree would be the flowering plants. Monocots. Down here, they've tucked the sunflowers way down here, and that represents sunflowers. The Ericaceae, the blueberries, and over here, the beans and the roses, the hibiscus, up here, the euphorbias, and they've represented what is basically our current understanding for the origins of these different groups. But there are a lot of other ways to look at it. So the first time someone is recorded as having put together a tree of life was by a Frenchman who was teaching botany and following up on concepts that were emerging in France by de Jussot and Lamarck and others about the nature of plants. He put together this tree, and each of these represents a genus, and these represent major groups of flowering plants. And he taught this as the basis for understanding flowering plants. We have in Charles Darwin's notebook an early kind of a cladogram by Darwin trying to explain how a species might or a genus might become separate or a group might become separate from others. And shortly after Darwin's species, Origin of Species, Haeckel published a very elaborate tree of life for all life. And so you can see the plants are here, the protista, and the animals. What's funny is this is all, it seems modern to us because cladistics is a kind of a contemporary topic. But if you go back to that original book, 1789, by Jussot, you're going to find that even his index to the treatment of families, and this is Genera Plantarum, according to the natural orders. Everything so-called an order we today call a family, and everything that he published as an order is automatically considered the valid name for that family. Okay, and he divided them in his index in a way that looks pretty much like a cladistic chart. It's very organized. Here's a modern way. Here's kind of reminiscent of Haeckel's tree of life. Here's a contemporary tree of life for all life. And you can see the plants are this green clay or this green branch coming off here. And there's all of the insects and the arthropods and mammals and birds and the dinosaurs having given rise to the rise to the birds. Over here, the same deal, but sort of reminiscent of Darwin's drawing with the plants just coming off at this very tip. I like the fact they gave the plants the very end. If you just look at flowering plants or plants, here is a contemporary cladogram of the flowering plants by order. Plant families are grouped into larger constituencies called orders. And here we have the Poales is right there. That's the grasses and the sedges. And here's the Aspergales. That would be the, a lot of things are in there now, the amaryllis and the orchids, and I think even the iris are in there. And then down here, what we call the fabids, and that would be the roses and the legumes, and even the oaks, the phagales, are in with the fabids, and the malvids with the hibiscus and mustards, the brassicales. And then finally down here, the tubular flowered things, the mints and the aster group. Now, there's another way of looking at that that's pretty recent, published in 2024. And think of this as a cylinder. You're looking at the very bottom of the cylinder, and this is the beginning of flowering plants. And what's rotating out of here are the different plant groups and the approximate time that the assumption has been made that they originated. Based on studying mutations, they can actually postulate a sequence or timing for when a certain mutation might have shown up. And so they've backed it up. And so this is like looking through a pipe back to the beginning of flowering plants. And you're seeing where science currently believes, botanists currently believe those plants emerged. So getting us to today then, right now, the assumption is that there are around almost 12,000 species of grasses, Poaceae. There's the Poales there. The grasses and the sedges are tucked in that little rectangle. The orchids are here tucked in to the Aspergales. The assumption is there are around 4,800 species of roses, 19,000 beans, 3,700 mustards, 7,000 mints, 4,000 Solanaceae, that's potato, tomato, tobacco, Rubiaceae, 14,000, because there are a lot of tropical trees. And then the Asteraceae is the big kahuna. This is 32,000. These are the 10 largest plant families, or among the 10. I don't know if I can't swear to the fact that they're exactly right, but these are 10 of the largest plant families. And together, these 10 families are more than a third of all the species diversity represented in this chart. Okay, let's go back to our tree then. So the tree from the Botanic Garden on the Mall, U.S. Botanic Garden, is very normal looking. But if you suddenly tried to make this tree account for the fact that fully a tenth of all known flowering plants are in the daisy family, all of a sudden that little piece of the branch would have to occupy a tenth of this tree. And if you look up here at the grasses and the orchids, the grasses, the sedges, and the orchids, they also account for more than a tenth. So all of a sudden, those little rectangles would have to occupy a lot more property, territory. So the trees of life are useful for understanding one aspect of plants and plant evolution, but they don't give you a real picture of as to how those plants fit together and what the scale is. Let's look at Florida for a second. So in Florida, in our flora, we have 180 families, more or less, of flowering plants. And that's as compared to the 416 worldwide. Of those 180, 130 are what we call eudicots, the real cleanly, not the ancient basal ones, but the clean modern dicots. And 39 are monocots. That would be grasses, orchids, lilies. 43 families have a single taxon in Florida. So of 180 families, 43 only have the native flora of Florida only includes one. And 90 more only have five. Therefore, like 50% of our flowering plant families are represented by very few species. So that five families each have over 100 taxa, the Orchidaceae, the Fabaceae, the Cyperaceae. So the orchids, the beans, the sedges, the grasses, and the asters. If you add these families, the dogbanes or the Asclepiads, the morning glories, the Rubiaceae, the matters, the euphorbs, and the mints, then those families together have more than half of the native flora. So the question then is, which families should we cover? Because if you could learn 10 families, you would pretty much have a key to understanding 50% of the plant diversity you might encounter out in the wild. Do we want to learn by that diversity and abundance? Do we want to attack families based on the ease of identification, the range of habitat, or just personal interest? And the truth, of course, is if you approach plants from a plant family aspect, it gives you a leg up, because if you can come up with a reasonable guess as to the plant family, you don't know how much agony that will avoid for you in trying to work your way through a family key. Because the further out you go, the harder the keys are. To key something to a family can be really difficult. But if you know the family, and then if you know the genus, you're home free in some cases. So let's analyze this a little bit more. There are the top 10 family groupings then: wildflowers, composites, grasses, sedges, legumes, trees and shrubs, oaks, heaths, that's the ericaceous stuff, roses, legumes, and exotics. This is the invasive and non-native stuff, grasses, legumes. This is the top 10 families in each grouping by number of taxa. Let's give them a formal names. It's the Asteraceae, the Poaceae, the Cyperaceae. Here it's the oaks, the Fagaceae, the Ericaceae, the Rosaceae over here. This is not very helpful until we start applying color. I love to color code things. So if you compare all Florida natives to the exotic plants in our flora, the orange text tells you which ones are in both lists, the top 10. So among the top 10 natives and the top 10 exotics, this many families are shared in a different order. But basically, the most prevalent, the greatest prevalent diversity of non-native plants in Florida would be the grasses, followed by the beans and the daisies. And it's not even a contest. The beans make sense because in our very sandy, non-fertile soils, the ability to harbor bacteria that manufacture nitrogen, that's pretty cool. And that gives the beans a leg up. Grasses, they just know how to grow. And asters, there's just so many of them that you're going to have some. Let's look at another chart. Let's compare just wildflowers to exotics. Similar, Asteraceae, Poaceae, Cyperaceae, Fabaceae. So the composites, the grasses, the sedges, the beans, the mints, and the euphorbs are present in both lists, the top 10 diversity of wildflowers as compared to exotics. What's missing? The Orchidaceae, the Convolvulaceae, the dogbanes, and the evening primroses are not as prevalent among the exotics, which have a lot of Malvaceae, a lot of tomato family, amaranths, and acanths. Now, let's compare them all just for the fun of it. This is kind of curious because what we see is that the one family that falls out as kind of interestingly different is the Fabaceae. And the reason is it's got a huge mix of both herbaceous plants, which we think of as wildflowers, and woody plants, which typically are in the trees and shrubs. So the Fabaceae is a big family among wildflowers. It's a big important family among trees and shrubs. And it's a big important family in the exotics. And the reason I even point this out is when you go out to figure out a plant, to understand a plant in the wild, plants do not identify themselves as a wildflower. You have to figure out what you're looking at. And that means basically you have to have a familiarity with the entire flora, including the exotics, or you may never figure something out, especially on edges and in disturbed areas. You're going to find a lot of exotics, and it takes a bit of learning to get accustomed to figuring out who's not native and who is. Now, there's another way of looking at wildflowers. Here's the 2011 guide. And here is I think the best book on wildflowers to use here in Florida. And one of the best wildflower books in the country is the Hammer Guide. Let's compare the top 20 families of wildflowers as listed from the flora, using numbers from ISB, from the Atlas, the Florida Atlas of Plants, to the families in the Hammer Guide. Now, I sat down and I made a list of every plant in the Hammer Guide, a little spreadsheet by family. And that list, if you go to the notes, there's a download option there. You can actually find that list and download it if you want to, because it's kind of convenient to look at the Hammer Guide based on plant family rather than color and genus. So you can play with that list and sort it any way you want to. Anyway, this is kind of fun. So the families in orange are represented in both. It's all the typical subjects, right? What's missing from the Hammer Guide, as far as numbers, as far as diversity goes, are the grasses and the sedges. He does have Iris and Rubiaceae, but not at the numbers that they're actually represented in the flora. What he represents that doesn't show up in the top 20 list here are these other families. They're pretty high, though. I mean, the Gentianaceae, the Polygonaceae, they have quite a few species. They just don't hit the top 20. And there's 22 over here, and the reason is that they were 4 tied for the 20th place, or 3, I guess. Anyway, so this is kind of a nice comparison, and you can find this information in the attached notes. So finally, just to put it all together then, here's our native plants, our exotic plants in our flora, and the worldwide. Once again, families in red that are in the top 10 in our native plants. Families, I've got a duplication here. That's not right. Something's missing. Asteraceae. Anyway, the Cyperaceae shouldn't be colored here. Or it's missing. Oh, yeah, no, there it is. What's missing? Oh, the Lamiaceae is out of place. And then the Asteraceae, the Fabaceae, the Poaceae, and the Cyperaceae. So the truth is, these are just big families. The Asteraceae, the Fabaceae, the grasses, and the sedges. They're just huge families. Okay, now, still back to that question, which families to cover? Well, I have good news for you. You already know most of them. It's not a big deal to learn the families here in Florida because they fall into kind of convenient categories, and I'm going to break them down for you. So let's get our head around wildflower plant families. I've decided to group them as the one-offs and the slam dunks. These are the plants that you will already know these families, and it's a lot. And then there's the big easies, and that's the composites and the orchids. There are the ones that are just too big to ignore, the legumes, Fabaceae, the sedges, and the grasses. Then there's a bunch that are not too big and they're kind of easy. We'll go walk through those. And then there's some that are just plain annoying. Okay. So the one-offs are the ones that there's only one or two native in the flora, and they're either restricted in range or they're very rare. Um, the chance that you're going to run into Crumia, which is the only species we have in the Staminaceae, is pretty small. You will run into geraniums, but you're not going to run into 30 species of them. And and it's the only native thing in the family, native, it's the only thing in the family native to our flora. So if you know geranium, you know the whole family as far as the flora goes. Um, you have to drive pretty far south to run into native populations of thalia. And so I'm calling that one totally tropical. Down here, tightly temperate. If you go to nice uh, extensions of the moist eastern forest here in Florida, you might be fortunate enough to run into one of the two or three species of uvularia, but in the Colchicaceae, but that's it. Um, you're going to know mistletoe when you see it. So I call it dependably dependent. If you're studying aquatic plants, then you might run into Batis. And if you walk on the road shoulders and see a rusty plant, then you've run into Polypremium, which is the only species in the entire Tetracondraceae and is easily identified and never noticed, since it's just kind of one of those things that hides out in the grasses. So you can ignore all of these. Slam dunks. These are families that if you know one or two genera that are very common, you know the family. So you can see the list: prickleweed, xerids, the smilex, hypoxis. Everything in the Smilicaceae is the genus Smilex. Um, Lacnanthes, it's the only genus of the Hemidoraceae we have. Dioscorea, very characteristic. Bromeliads, sundews, butter. So let's look at some of those. Well, perhaps the most complex one is the Lentibulariaceae, the family that houses Utricularias and Pinguiculas. But those are groups that wildflower people tend to know. And if you know those, you know the family. There are not that many species. Even more tightly, the Sarraceniaceae. Everything native in our flora is a Sarracenia, and they're pretty easy um, to remember, to know. They're so spectacular, so iconic that you will recognize them by their leaves or by their flowers or by their fruit. So if you know one Sarracenia, you know the family. Um, Drosera. Droseras are pretty darned easy to recognize to genus, and that's the only native members of the Droseraceae in Florida. We do have escaped populations of the near native Venus flytrap. So if you know Drosera and can recognize Venus flytrap, you know the whole family. The same is true of Rexia. There's one shrubby genus native, a species native to very South Florida, Meconia, but everything else that's a wildflower in the Melastomataceae in Florida is Rexia. Rexia mariana, Nashii, Lutea, Aliphanus. There are two or three others. So if you can recognize and know Orexia, which is a wonderful common wildflower, then you've got, at least from the viewpoint of Florida, you've got the entire Molostomataceae under control. The same is true of the Clusiaceae. There's one other species, uh, the Rosia, that's present in South Florida, that's sort of a shrub, kind of thick, succulent, shrubby thing. But all of the hypericums, if you want to consider them wildflowers, are easily recognizable. Um, Sometimes they break them into other genera, but this is Hypericum cystifolium, the most common one along road shoulders. Hypericum myrtifolium, a beautiful one that occurs around cypress swamps. Microcephalum in flower right now, all along the road shoulders, and a little annual weed, Mutilum. Many others. There's like 25 species, 30 species. But if you know one Hypericum, you know the family. And violets are the same way. If uh, there's one other genus that barely intrudes, and it's very different, and it's not commonly collected. Everything else is a viola. This is the little one. This is probably the most common violet in Florida. Vittata. It grows in wet shoulders everywhere. Septim loba, one of the large woodland species, the beautiful Viola walteri, the very messy Viola sororia. So if you know violet, you know the Violaceae, at least in Florida. I think the same is true of Polygala. Yeah, they do vary some, but if you recognize Polygala, um, or you decide to use the genus Seneca, or decide to use, there's one other Amarella one, the one for the small gay flower. You know the whole Polygalaceae. They're like many species, but they're easily recognized, and the family is not much more complex. Here's some others just to, if you know one hypoxis, you know the whole hypoxis. If you know Lacnanthes, you know the Hemidoraceae. If you know the look and shape of Dioscorea, you know that family. The Xeridaceae, the Hydrocaritaceae, you're not going to run into many of those. They're water plants. Smilex, if you know Smilex, you know the whole family. And Oxalis, if you know one Oxalis, you know Oxalis. So let's get to the big families. And the two big and easy families. The Orchidaceae is huge, but it's easy. They're terrestrials, they're all herbs. They all have strongly zygomorphic flowers. That means bilaterally symmetrical. They all have 3 petals, and one of those is highly modified as the lip. The lip is positioned opposite of a structure called the column, which is the combined structure for both male and female parts, the stigma and the stamen. Okay, they all develop a dry capsule, and in that capsule are seed that have no embryos. They are very tiny spore-like seed. So let's look at the parts. Here's a cymbidium. There's the anther cap. This is the column. The stigma is tucked up inside there, right under there. Dorsal sepal, lateral sepal, lateral sepal. So 1, 2, 3 in a triangle. Lateral petal, labellum. Now this is an exotic orchid, but I just used it because it's so easy to show you the parts. Let's look at a native. Here's Platanthera chapmanii. Okay, there's the labellum. That's the dorsal sepal. This is the column. And in the Platantheras, the anther falls into 2 distinct sacs, and the stigma is up in there between them. Okay, so here we have the anther bends down. That sticky thing is the vasidium. The pollinium attaches to that. There's one pulled out some. Here is the pollinium on a pine straw, pulled out of the flower. There's the lateral petals, these 2 little pale, and then flip down to the side like wings. Those are the lateral sepals. So it's the same structure. Let's go back. It's the same structure as this, just highly modified, right? Now, let's look at it a little bit closer. Here's the Vasidia. This thing is called a spur or a nectary, and it is an extension from the fringed petal, and it has an opening, an orifice inside here. And these Vasidia stick to the proboscis of a visiting butterfly. Okay, there's how they stick. Now, another big family, the asters, the daisies. This is an easy family, and it's the largest family. Composites. In the composite, you all know this, there are many flowers, sometimes not so many, sometimes as few as 2 or 3 florets that are grouped together by leafy structures called phyllaries or involucral bracts. And so that involucre, which means an envelope, wraps around this expanded receptacle on which all these flowers are positioned. And it looks like a flower, but it's made of hundreds of flowers. So that's why they use the term pseudanthia. So the tubular florets that may be sterile, may be fertile, depending on the plant. Each flower, each floret makes a special kind of an achene called a sepsilla. They don't have a normal calyx. They may have what's called a um, anyway. Um, anyway, I'm having a senior moment. So then they have five anthers that cling together, and that's kind of a funny thing, and that's where the term synantherology comes from. The stuck together anthers. Um, and they always have, each flower that has a stigma has a bifid stigma, like a snake's tongue. Okay, so let's look at some asters. Phabanthus, Chaptalia, Marshallia, native wildflowers. And you can see here, there's a floret. This one has all disc florets. And notice the anthers are stuck together in this tube. And there are the five petals. Let's look at, so this head is called a capitulum, and the sepsilla is the name for the fruit. Here we have again Chaptalia, Berlandiera up north, the green eyes, because so you're looking at a head here with a lot of florets. Each floret may or may not have a pale, a bract at its base. In the Berlandieras, that bract is very evident and it's green. Okay. And then there may be no ray florets, or there may be very few. This is chrysoma, and it's got a head with just a few discs and a few ray florets. Let's look at Stochezia for a second. It's a funny one because in Stochezia, the florets vary from being very tubular all the way to looking like ray florets, but there are things in between. So here's the receptacle, there's the involucre, and here are the florets. Here's the involucre after the florets after we've gone to seeding, and here's a dry involucre. The involucre of Stochezia is particularly spiny, very, very interesting. A more normal one daisy might be Phabanthus. One of my favorites. This is an incredible plant. It grows by these really curious thickened rhizomes deep in the ground, and it makes these tall stems that no matter what you touch them and bend them, they just come right back up to attention. They're remarkable. And one of the things it does, along with Baldwina and a few others, is it will lose all of its ray flowers, and you'll be out in the field and you'll think, what is that? Well, it's just this having lost its ray flowers. So involucral bracts. The nature of the involucral bracts is incredibly important to keying these out. So here, ray flowers and disc flowers. There you see the stamens stuck together in a group of five. Another family, two families, too big to ignore, and I have ignored them my entire life. Until now, I've been forced to learn a little bit about the grasses and the sedges. Here's Urniella, our sea oats, and here from out in my yard is a plant I learned. It's probably the only sedge genus I ever knew, and then they sunk it. Chromalina, and they've sunken it into Rhynchospora, which was sadness for me because it was about all I knew about sedges for decades. But let's look at sedges for a second and grasses. Grasses have jointed stems, and the leaf sheath, which wraps around the stem, is split to the base. Whereas if you can get to the point of seeing a sheath on a leaf in a sedge, it's closed. And the leaves in sedges, normally, not all, are basal. Okay, the grasses are two ranked. The leaves come out in two ranks. The sedges in general are triangular. And this is what we've all used our whole lives. Sedges have edges, but sedges also have that triangular phyllotaxy, which is a boon when you're out in the field. They both have reduced flowers in what are called spikelets. But the grass spikelets are different. They always have these two basal glumes, not always, but almost always. Um, Whereas, and very often just have one or two fertile or sterile flowers. They're very different. These the typically the flowers on the spikelets are more spiral. Um, the grasses have this strange pair of bract things called the lemma and the palea. Um, in the sedges, each flower is just subtended by a bract. The anthers of grasses are sagittate. We'll see a picture of that. That have the little corners sticking off like something. Um, the anthers of sedges are not sagittate. Um, the grass ovary matures as a one-seeded grain called a caryopsis, and the fruit wall is totally fused to the seed. And that's really distinct. Um, the the fruit of a sedge is an achene, and the seed is separate inside that fruit. So here, let's look at the sedges for a second. When you get into the sedges, you're in a world of terminology. Um, there's the achene. These bristles may or may not be present depending on the genus, and these are considered like reduced perianth segments. And then the style leaves a base, a swollen base that, depending on the type of sedge, is very characteristic. That's called a tubercle. And here's Rhynchospora with this huge snout-like or pointed. Here are some fresh ones from my yard. Uh, I think that's genus Carex, not Carex, Cyperus, and I keyed this to Carex, but I'm not so certain. It's got fimbriate, three fimbriate stigmas, and there's a genus called Fimbrostylus that has fimbriate stigmas, but this keys out to a Carex. At least I think it does. I want to show you this. This is crazy. So a wonderful botanist who's passed away now, Ilkka Kukkonen from Finland, did a huge study and published in 1984. And this is a Carex inflorescence. And what he did was he broke it down into every constituent part evolutionarily or developmentally. So this Carex is actually interpreted as this branching structure. A huge amount of work went into understanding developmentally the reduced nature of a Carex spikelet and how that formed if you stretched it out and if everything developed into a more full-fledged component, this is what you would have. I just think that's kind of fun. It's not useful for our discussion, but it reminds us that the grasses and the sedges have incredibly reduced flowers. Let's go to the grasses for a second. A really wonderful grass native here in the Panhandle and sort of restricted in distribution is the grass Tinium, the toothache grass. And it's just gorgeous. Any time of the year, it's really pretty. One that you've all run into, if nothing else, you've had a bicycle tire punctured by it, is Cincrus, the sandspur. And what we learn is that these spines around the edge are not part of the flower. The flowers are tucked inside. These are bracts and stem structures that are reduced, highly reduced, and they end up being spiny. So it's a very complex inflorescence. The way to learn about grasses, if you want to get into them, I recommend going online, and you can get it for free, and finding the 1922 book by Agnes Chase called The First Book of Grasses. I have never found anything that more clearly explains grasses. Yes, it's complex, and yes, you're going to need a hand lens or a microscope to really get into them, but it's full of illustrations, and one by one, she explains all these different structures, and that's a basic grass floret with the lemma and the pale, potentially three anthers, potentially a stigma that may be, well, let's look at one. I think there's one, right? No, I don't guess I didn't bring it for you. I had a picture I wanted to show you of a stigma that's plumose. The stigmas on grasses can be very highly branched. Okay, let's get to a group that's big, maybe not quite as easy. They're easy from the viewpoint of the fruit. By their fruit ye shall know them. The beans, the legumes. This is the Fabaceae. Okay, that's a garden pea. This is Desmodium, and here's the lupinus on the coast. So you have to know them by their fruit because the flowers can be a little bit more difficult. Here's the native, kind of weedy but native Vigna luteola, the pea-shaped flower, and a bean, a legume for fruit, and the typical compound leaf, the trifoliate leaf on this vine. But these are legumes too. The acacia type with very reduced petals and showy anthers that are free, showing up in a cluster, all of the powder puff things and the acacias. And then down here, the medallion type, this is our native Chamaecrista fasciculata with the bean fruit and the anthers and 5 petals that are a little bit more equal, but very showy. These are in the same subfamily. And then we have Dahlia, which is in the pea family, but the flowers don't look that much like peas, the pea subfamily. And then we have on our streets in the southern part of the state, Bauhinia, which is a tropical tree. And there's the bean, there's the legume, and the limited number of stamens. So those flowers, looking so very different, all produce a similar fruit, and that's what holds the family together. Let's look at wisteria. And I know it's not native, but it conquers trees all over the panhandle. So it's I would classify it as an invasive, even if it's beautiful. Here's the panicle flowers or the raceme of flowers. There's a pea flower intact. Here's one that I've pulled one of the wing petals. See that petal right there? There's 2 of those, and they enclose the sexual parts. I pulled one off, and there you can see the stamens, didelphus, 9 stamens in one cluster, and then a free stamen. Tucked into that, okay, is the piece. So I took off the 9 united stamens, and there is the future bean pod of wisteria, and that's what makes it a bean. Here we have Chamaecrista, our native, and there's the fruit right there, the ovary. So here we have it again. So you can see the anthers being free, and then you can see the ovary, the style, and the stigma. And then that matures into this fruit. Now, some families that are not so big, but mostly easy, the Apocynaceae, the Forbiaceae, the evening primroses, the Onygraceae, the morning glories, Convolvulaceae, and the mints, Lamiaceae. Let's just breeze through those. I don't have much on the mints. You all are accustomed to the fact that they have typically, not always, typically square stems, opposite leaves, very often a fragrance to the foliage, and the flowers are incredibly zygomorphic. Here's Monarda tucrium, which, believe it or not, there's a native one, Tucrium canadense. It's all around the road shoulders here. And then the rare McBridea up in the forest. So the mint family, a big family for us. The Apocynaceae, I say it has a split personality because 2 families that were often considered very separate were the Asclepiadaceae and the Apocynaceae, but they really grade into one another, so they've been brought together as one family. The non-native South African Catharanthus, that's the vinca they call it, or whatever, it's called many different things. The native Amsonia ciliata, and then we have like 22 species of Asclepias, longifolia, virigula. Here's some drawings just to kind of help explain them. So this is Catharanthus out of Judd's et al. Book on plant systematics. There's the bud. The petals on these are often twisted. This is all part of the corolla. And see that expansion there? That expansion on the inside shows you a character that is shared by this family. The anthers born on the tube of the petals, and then this thumbtack looking stigmatic thing called a capitulum. It varies. In Catharanthus, it's free. In Amasonia, the one we just looked at, the anthers sort of attach to the capitulum. And that's further carried out over here in the Asclepias, where it's totally complex together. And you have this ovary and this complex here around which these special hoods are formed. So what's cool about the Asclepiads is they really stand out as distinct species. And if you go even from 1954, Woodson's treatment hasn't really been surpassed. So you can go find Woodson's treatment from 1994 of all the Asclepiads in North America. And he had a drawing of each one. I've pulled all the drawings out for all the native Asclepias, and they're posted in that in the notes. So you can see a comparison of all 20 plus species with drawings pulled out of Woodson's 1954 publication. But here's that crazy structure. The petals and sepals turn down. These are special developments from the anthers, a hood and a horn. But the pollen, the anther portion is sealed to that structure. And it's crazy because that is one anther, that's an anther, that's an anther. They're five, right? But they are attached to one another by these strange translators, such that this pollinium from one anther and this pollinium from another are tied together. They look like this, okay? And that's wraps around the tarsus or the some body part of an insect and is pulled out. And it has to get back into a slit to get into the stigmatic cavity, which is tucked inside here. It is a crazy, highly evolved set of circumstances, but it makes for beautiful flowers. The Onygraceae, the evening primrose family, that's been made simpler. We used to segregate Gaura from Enothera and, of course, Ludwigia. Now, in our flora, they only accept two genera, the genus Enothera, which includes Gaura, and the genus Ludwigia. I basically understand them from the generalized viewpoint that if the stigma is branched or somewhat peltate, united a bit, it's probably Enothera. If the stigma is capitate, it's probably going to be Ludwigia. Here's a drawing of Ludwigia. Notice it has an inferior fruit and these four sepals at the top. Convolvulaceae, the petals are all united in a tube. This is the native Ipomoea sagittata. We'll look at that again. This is a non-native indica Ipomoea, and then the beech morning gloria. So here's sagittata growing along the marshes right in front of our house. And if you rip the petals off, this is what you see inside. You see a superior ovary, a long style, and this very papillate stigma, and then the stamens, the hastate leaves. Finally, we come to the Euphorbiaceae, which is kind of complex like the Asclepiads. It has two faces. It's got the ones that develop perianths that are intact and look very floral, Jatropha here with Nodosculus. And then it's got the ones that develop these really strange flowering structures. They're not individual flowers. Croton and Euphorbia. Let's go a little bit closer. And they are called Cyathea. So that is not a single flower. That is a structure with incredibly reduced components. So each anther, and in this case, stigma, represents a separate flower. So this is a highly reduced, highly modified, and highly compacted inflorescence, believe it or not. So if we go back and look at the poinsettia, then of course those are leaf-like, those are bract-like leaves with color, whereas each of these structures is a separate inflorescence with individually high reduced flowers. Here is a typical looking um, ovary with branched style. Look over here at the croton and you'll see that. There's a pedicel sticking out, and this would be the whole structure, and tucked in there is the ovary with the three branch style. Here's a euphorbia I took this picture at Torrey National Park, and this was right next to it. Here's a euphorbia, and there's the cythium, and there's the three lobes to a little ovary that's tucked down in there. So the Euphorbiaceae is incredible. How will you know them? Well, the first thing is they're going to typically have alternate leaves and a milky sap. And if you see a three-lobed ovary, you've probably got your hands on a euphorb. So don't put your fingers anywhere near your eyes, because the milky sap on euphorbs can be very corrosive and very damaging. So don't get if you're, in general, when you're handling plants in the wild, wash your hands. Don't put your hands near your eyes, because you never know what you're going to run into. Um, Finally, the annoying families, and there are two or three. The one that's annoying me the most right now is the Plantagenaceae. They have taken the scroffs and they have broken up that gang of mine, and they have put them together. So the Plantagenaceae today has Plantago, of course, because it's the Plantagenaceae. But they've put digitalis in it, foxglove. They've pulled in scoparia, which is a little herb. We've got a native, and then there's an introduced one, Scoparia dulcis. And they've even pulled in the caltriches, the water plants. So this is crazy. Here we've got this family that makes no sense to me anymore. But I guess they had to have a bucket to put everything that was left over in. I'm not certain. Stay tuned. This is going to have to change. Well, that gets me to the end of my diatribe, reminding you that on the 21st of May, we're going to talk about terminology. And on the 18th of June, we're going to talk about keying plants with some hints on how to more easily key out plants that you run into. And that is it.
Awesome. Well, wonderful as always, and so informative and interesting. I really have loved and enjoyed how you've included the historical context in all of these topics. It's so fascinating to learn about how we got to where we are today. We don't really have any topical questions. Someone is curious what kind of camera you use, because they're loving all of your photos. So if you would like to share that.
You know, what's astonishing is what you can do with a cell phone. Um, I'm constantly amazed when I get a better picture with a cell phone than I do. The camera I use the most for the close-ups is just, it's a Nikon Z with a micro lens. And
Mm,
I use that a lot. And sometimes I've got all these lenses, and then I'm frustrated when the picture I took with my cell phone is better than the one I took with so it really isn't the quality of the equipment that matters. I think it has a lot to do with the person taking the photographs.
absolutely. Great, thank you. Okay.
By the way, I, I hate to use the word steal, but I do borrow a lot of images, and I try to put a note where I borrowed them. I call it borrowing, and it's called fair use. I'm not selling. I'm not selling anything. I'm not making a penny. You're not making a penny. So it's fair use, and I'm not publishing them in a printed medium. But but I do try to mention I have taken a lot of images from the kind people who donated images to the ISB.
Mhm.
That's a remarkable resource that you have available to you as people in Florida. And they let you download you can download the whole darn thing. They have photos that have been vetted. Um, Probably the best way that you might learn grasses and sedges is to go into the photo file in ISB and just look at all the images and try to key them out and try to understand the image and the herbarium specimen as compared to the description. So, so
I
it's a
use
great resource.
I use the
Huh?
ISB. I use the ISB almost daily, and I popped it in the chat earlier in the presentation when you were talking about it. But I just put the link in again now for folks to find that if they're not familiar with it. It is an incredible resource for learning Florida flora. So absolutely. Well, thank you again so much, Jim. This was fantastic. We're getting some great feedback in the chat. So glad everybody enjoyed it. And be sure to join us again next month for
Okay.
what's the topic? What are we doing?
Next, I got it mixed up before, and I did the plant families before I did the other one. I think the next one's terminology,
That's
and
right.
then we're going to do keying. And in the keying one, we're going to talk about strategies to make keying less painful. Okay.
That's what we all need. All right,
Okay.
everybody. Well, thanks again and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Bye.